Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Soldier of Fortune Payback for PC, Xbox 360, and PlayStation 3. What you're seeing here is the PC version. This is a first-person shooter and the third game in the Soldier of Fortune series, although it has basically nothing at all to do with the previous two games. Unlike the previous two games, which were developed by Raven Software, this one was developed by the Slovak company Cauldron and published by Activision in 2007. And of course, like the previous two games, it did receive a bit of controversy considering how ridiculously violent the game is. It has a lot of blood and gore and a lot of dismemberment in it, which of course means that the Australian ratings board just couldn't handle it and they banned the original version of the game, causing a dismemberment-free version to be released in Australia instead, and the German ratings board just banned it from their country outright. Now, this is not really the video for a discussion of video game censorship, but in this particular case, you could take a look at the reception the game had on its launch and go, oh, well, obviously they did their countries a favor because this wasn't very well received on launch. But that's just writing off the game entirely without actually examining it and seeing what exactly makes it tick and whether or not it's actually worth playing. So let's go ahead and start delving into this thing and finding out what exactly we're dealing with here. Well, as far as presentation goes, I really hope you like the colors brown, gray, green, and red, because that's all you're gonna see in this game. Yep, it's one of those brown and gray and realistic kind of games. Now, apart from the color scheme being absolutely terrible, what about the rest of the visuals? Well, the modeling is about on par with what you would expect from a more middle-tier game from that particular year of 2007, and the texture work is definitely fairly low-res in a lot of spots. The environments are also fairly well detailed for the most part, and do a pretty decent job of conveying whatever setting they're trying to convey. But that said, they are all very much the same as just about any other modern military shooter out there, which means that you're going to get this definite sense of deja vu when you're wandering around these various levels. Beyond the environments, the character models and animations are mostly alright, although the animations can be a bit iffy here and there. Namely for third-person animations, because actually the weapon animations are surprisingly good in this game. I mean, it's down to even the small touches like the way that shotguns get reloaded, where you're sticking one shell in at a time, but you're actually holding multiple shells in your hand, and you can actually see him switching between the shells before reaching back to grab more of them to continue filling up the magazine. It's a neat touch that you really don't see replicated in any other first-person shooter out there, so that's kind of cool. But the weapon models themselves can be a bit iffy, because certain weapons actually don't have any rear sights, which is absolutely baffling. But then you move on into other aspects of the presentation, namely the particle effects, and those either look surprisingly decent, like in the case of the blood spurts, or absolutely awful in the case of the explosions. The explosions look like they were ripped directly from a PS2 game. It's pretty awful, but the blood spurts, on the other hand, actually behave surprisingly realistically for fluid dynamics, albeit not necessarily realistic in terms of the actual blood and gore being depicted. You see, one of the main hallmarks of the Soldier of Fortune series is that it is a ridiculously gory game series, and the previous game actually has better gore than this, because in this game you get dismemberment, sure, but it's just a solid the limb falls off, or it's the head disappears, and that's pretty much it. Meanwhile, in Soldier of Fortune 2, the system was ridiculously detailed to the point where you could actually blast an enemy in the head and you would see bits and pieces of their skull and brain sticking out. It was rather gruesome for its time, and even today it actually is still surprisingly gruesome. Payback, on the other hand, has a lot of ragdolls and a lot of limbs flying off in incredibly goofy-looking fashions, so instead of it looking gruesome, it just looks silly. But not only does it look silly, it sounds silly as well. I mean, you've got music which is extremely generic, extremely repetitive, and way too loud, even on the absolute lowest volume. You've got gun and explosion sounds that are not remotely beefy, and in fact, pretty much all of the guns sound the same, which is really weird and also really annoying. You can barely tell a difference between when you're shooting, for example, the AK-47, the M16, the various SCAR rifles, whatever it may well be, and even comparing those to shotguns, it's barely even different. And absolutely none of them sound good anyway, so it's not like it matters. But then you come to the crown jewel of the awful sound design, and that is the voice acting, which ranges from vaguely tolerable to what in the hell were you thinking? It'd be one thing if it were so bad it's funny, but it's not that kind of bad. It's just the cringe-inducing kind of bad. And every single time they say something, either it is drowned out by the rest of the sound because the rest of the sound is hilariously loud comparatively, or it's the audio equivalent of being smacked in the head with a baseball bat.
Order of Boss Ethan. Guards everywhere. You no get past.
And if it were only during the cutscenes that it were that bad, then it would be one thing, but they even force that on you in normal gameplay, and when you're fighting the bosses, they will repeat their lines over and over and over again as if this is the first time they've said it, until eventually you feel yourself descending into madness. And you know what the really sad part is? That's actually better than the alternative, because the alternative is this. Yep, if you play this game on any operating system more recent than Windows XP, then you actually have to go and get a specific fix to restore legacy audio effects on whatever chipset you have. Otherwise, the audio comes through like what you just heard, or it just doesn't come through at all. Although, honestly, it not coming through at all would probably be better in the long run. But here's the thing, in the grand scheme of things, that's not really that big of a deal, because, let's face it, this is a bit of a legacy game. I can understand there being some issues with modern operating systems, and at least this one is something that's relatively easy to fix. What's less forgivable are engine problems that I will actually get to when I get to the gameplay portion of this, because they're actually a pretty major issue. And speaking of, that's what really matter here, the story and the gameplay. So the story in this is that you play as a mercenary named Thomas Mason, and after being betrayed on a mission, you go up against this worldwide criminal organization that's financing all kinds of terrible people. And that's actually kind of it, because the game doesn't really concern itself much with the story at all. Oh, don't get me wrong, the game will still throw you into unskippable cutscenes with hilariously terrible camera work, but when you get down to it, the entire game is literally just an excuse for you to go into every single one of these levels, mow down everything in your path, and just continue on to the next level. You are a one-man army going up against an entire horde of nothing but the most generic bad guys they could possibly think of for a modern military shooter. It's not even facepalm-inducing so much as it's head desk-inducing. And the only thing that ties this with the original two games is that the organization you work for is simply called The Shop. There is literally nothing else that is remotely related to either of the previous games, and as for everything they do with regards to the story here, you just don't give a crap. You'll go into a level, it'll introduce you to the specific target that you're trying to take down for that particular level, and then you'll fight them in a really anticlimactic boss fight, move on to the next area, and repeat the process ad nauseum. Along the way, your handler Decker will be chatting to you over the radio, and she'll occasionally give you some information about what it is that you're doing, but it's never anything more than either the most basic of context for your actions, or a pitiful excuse of an attempt at banter with the protagonist. Absolutely none of the characters in this game have any depth whatsoever, including the protagonist, who is basically just a psychopath. And with the story and character departments being so devoid of really anything, it ultimately falls entirely to the gameplay to bring things up. And the gameplay consists of, well, just going from point A to point B and mowing down everything in your path. They do occasionally give you some objectives to complete, which basically involves go to location, interact with thing, but beyond that, there's really not much to the game at all. And while that's not necessarily a bad thing, when you actually go in and try to play this thing, that's when everything falls to bits. You have 3 weapon slots, 1 for a pistol, and then 2 for your primary and secondary weapons. You're given the opportunity to choose a loadout at the beginning of every single level, and you can pick whichever primary weapon you want, whichever secondary weapon you want, which are both just weapons from the same pool of items, from assault rifles to shotguns to machine guns and sniper rifles, etc. And you can also customize those to some degree. If you want to put a specific kind of optic on it, whether that be a straight up scope or just a red dot or a holographic sight or whatever it may well be, as long as the gun actually supports that, you can do so. You can also stick grenade launchers on them, or stick foregrips on them, or suppressors if they actually support that. The thing is that apart from the grenade launchers and the sights, you're really not gonna notice much of a difference with any of the weapons you're using. Pretty much all of the assault rifles function exactly the same as the submachine guns and the machine guns in this, only with different magazine capacities. The only real distinguishing feature of the assault rifles is that on most of them you can mount a grenade launcher. But the thing is that you're going to be constantly swapping out your weapons when you're actually in the middle of the level, because you're going to run out of ammo eventually because they just throw that many enemies at you, and you're just going to pick up whatever the enemy has that you're able to get ammo for, which is almost nothing but AK-47s. And whenever you pick up a weapon that the enemy has been using, they are always the base weapon without any optics or other attachments on them. It pretty much removes the point of the attachment system entirely, and even really removes the point of the loadout system entirely. But even if you are using customized weapons, it's not like they actually make any real difference in the matter. You're going to be fighting the same enemies regardless, and they're going to be taking the same amount of damage regardless. Supposedly the game has different weapon stats, but they don't seem to have any effect, and just about every single gun in the game has the same effect on target, at least as far as its general class goes. For example, all of the assault rifles pretty much behave the same. All of the submachine guns pretty much behave the same. There's not really any major difference between the amount of damage output or whatever it may well be that might supposedly differentiate them. Even the amount of recoil you experience from everything is going to be the same no matter what you're using, and that amount of recoil is basically none at all. You can basically just place the crosshair on an enemy, hold the fire button down, and then marvel as you empty your magazine without that crosshair moving much at all. Of course, even with there being almost no recoil in this game at all, they still have arbitrary inaccuracy, so your shots are never going to go exactly to point of aim. The only guns that do actually go to point of aim are the sniper rifles. What this ultimately means is that unless you are using a sniper rifle, most of the time you're just going to hold the crosshair wherever the enemy is and just hold the mouse button down until they fall over. Absolutely none of the guns in this thing actually feel like they have any real weight behind them. The only one that even comes close is the category of shotguns because they're devastating on target, but even then, they're only devastating on target because they put out a large volume of shot all at once. But even aside from the weapon handling, the combat just ends up being an exercise in utter tedium, not just because the weapon handling is so weak, but also because the enemy AI is astoundingly stupid. Their tactics are as follows. A. They will run into your line of fire and get themselves chewed to bits. B. They will hang back and shoot at you. There is nothing else. Their accuracy varies wildly. Sometimes they are pinpoint accurate from half a mile away in angles that are completely impossible to hit you at. Other times, they can't hit the broadside of a barn. And the thing is, when they do hit you, sometimes it takes multiple hits to bring you down, and sometimes they instantly drop you without any rhyme or reason. I've seen this happen from not only enemies like snipers or enemies with grenade launchers or whatever it may well be that do ridiculous amounts of damage, or at least in theory, but I've also seen it with enemies that just run around with the basic AKs, or enemies that are running around with submachine guns, or enemies that are running around with shotguns. In fact, it's that last category that is most consistent in the ridiculous amount of bullshit deaths. Because you'll round a corner, an enemy will be there with a shotgun, they'll be able to react before you, and instantly you're dead and wondering what the hell just happened. This inconsistency starts off really annoying and eventually gets outright infuriating the further you get into the game and the more apparent it becomes. Because it's not even a matter of, oh, well, you just screwed up because you didn't use cover or whatever it may well be. No, you just instantly die and then you have to start from the last checkpoint and you're wondering what the hell just happened. I mean, it's not like we're playing Rainbow Six here where everybody goes down in basically one hit. Instead, it's a game that actually has a regenerating health system where the only way you're able to tell that you're taking damage is by seeing the sides of the screen get more and more red until eventually the entire screen is red, and every so often you just have to hang back behind cover and let your health recharge. Of course, that's just assuming the game doesn't insta-give you anyway. But the sad part is, I can't tell if the game is designed such that it has a ridiculous amount of bullshit deaths, or if that's just a bunch of bugs and glitches. Because even fully patched, this game lacks certain basic functionalities, and on top of that, it has some pretty severe bugs in it. I've already mentioned the audio glitch, but there's also a glitch where if you don't force enable VSync, you actually have to do this outside of the game through the video card options. You have to enable VSync, otherwise your bullets will actually pass straight through enemies and do absolutely no damage to them at all, whereas of course their shots will still do damage to you. It's absolutely astounding that a game-breaking glitch like that exists, but it does. And keep in mind, that's with the game fully patched to the latest version. It just does that. It's a weird problem with the engine. Hell, the engine is so messily put together that even though it does actually natively support 1080p, it's only available by editing the config file, which doesn't sound like that big of a deal until you realize that the config file isn't in normal text. It's in hex. You actually have to go and get a hex editor to be able to edit the config file. It's the kind of thing that just leaves you scratching your head in confusion. And if you thought the engine problems ended there, well, you're sorely mistaken. Not only is the game glitchy as hell, and not only does it require you to edit the game's config file with a hex editor to be able to actually get 1080p, but it's absolutely riddled with completely random performance problems, where the frame rate will just randomly tank down below 30 frames per second, which given the rig I'm running is completely absurd. Thus, when you bring everything together, not only is this just a terrible game, but it actually fails at being basic software. And the fact that a game this awful has the Soldier of Fortune name slapped on it is just downright insulting. This series deserved far better than this piece of complete garbage. And the most depressing part of it is that it seems like we're actually never going to get another game in this series. Which ultimately means that it's incredibly sad to say, but this series went out on a game that's a 0.5 out of 5. Soldier of Fortune Payback is just an absolutely miserable experience of a first-person shooter, and the fact that it has the Soldier of Fortune name on it, and the fact that it is the last game in the series, is just insulting to everyone who ever actually liked that series to begin with. Thanks for watching.